Welcome to episode 24 of the 3 a.m. Fear podcast. Deep in the heart of rural Ohio, a small town called Circleville was once home to a terrifying mystery that still remains unsolved to this day. It all began in the hot summer of 1976 when a series of handwritten letters began arriving in the mailboxes of Circleville's unsuspecting residents. At first, the letters seemed like harmless pranks. But as time went on, the tone of the letters turned sinister, and the townspeople began to fear for their lives. The letters were all addressed to different people, but they all contained one common thread. The author was watching. The letters were filled with intimate details about the recipient's life, and the author seemed to know everything about them. The residents of Circleville were terrified, and no one knew who this author was or what their motives were. For years, the identity of the author remained a mystery, and to this day, no one could find out who the actual author was. In this episode, we will explore the Circleville Letters mystery, one of the most puzzling cases in Ohio's history. Hello and welcome to the 3 a.m. Fear podcast. I'm Nikita Ferrao, mystery and thriller author. On this podcast, I talk about real crimes and real people. Due to the graphic nature of some of this content, listener discretion is advised. You can find the episode show notes on my website 3amfear.com. Let's get started. Circleville, Ohio is about 25 miles south of Columbus. In the late 70s, it was a typical small American rural town. There was nothing scary about it. People knew their neighbors and lived a happy life. But we all know that with a small town, it's a little difficult to keep a secret. And that's exactly what happened here. The first letter was received in 1976. Mary Gillespie, who was a school bus driver, was the first of many people in Circleville who would receive mysterious letters from an anonymous sender. The letters contained cryptic messages and personal information that led many to believe that the letter writer knew them personally. The letter, like many others that would follow, was written in big block letters with details of Mary's life that only she would know. Her letter writer accused her of having an affair with the superintendent of schools. Like Mary, the rest of the town residents also found handwritten envelopes postmarked from the city of Columbus in their mailboxes with no return address. The letters were filled with their private details, accusations, and threats, making the recipients feel terrified of who might be watching them. I'll get to Mary and her letter's contents in a minute, but first, let's get to know about Gordon Massey. On March 3, 1977, Gordon Massey, the superintendent of Westfall schools, found a letter waiting for him in his mailbox. The letter read, quote, "Dear sir, according to my girlfriend, you have asked her to go out many times and have asked other female bus driver too. This must stop at once for the good of the school and families. If they are not stopped, I will be forced to write to the school board, and I would hate to do that. To prey on another man's girl is untouchable. I suggest you to find yourself a pimple-faced and start up with her and leave my girls alone." End quote. The letter writer stated that Gordon had asked his girlfriend to go out with him several times and many other female bus drivers too. The letter writer further threatened Gordon, saying that if he did not stop at once, he would be forced to write to the school board, and he wouldn't like that. The letter writer further said that it would be better if Gordon found himself someone else and left his girls alone. Now, coming to Gordon, Gordon was a happily married man at that time with his wife and loving son. However, the contents of the letter seemed to suggest he wasn't quite the wholesome family man that he appeared to be. This was one of the many letters that would follow. Each letter would contain threats stating that the letter writer would cut the brake line in his car if he didn't stop sleeping around with his employees. The same day, a letter arrived with the school board describing how Gordon assaulted women and sometimes even had extramarital affairs with female bus drivers. The writer demanded Gordon be fired from his job. A few weeks later, the school's vice principal received a letter demanding him to talk to Gordon about his affairs. Quote, "I shall warn you. I know the truth. I want to protect your school. It has a good reputation. You should keep it like that. I shall send you proof about driver number 62917. She has a child in school there now. I shall prove this shortly. I expect him then to be discharged. You'll see that I'm telling the truth." End quote. The letter was oddly specific, although no names were mentioned. When the driver number was looked up, it turned out to be none other than Mary Gillespie. If you knew Mary, then you would know that she was not the one to be involved in any form of scandal. She had a happy family, a nice life, and a close-knit group of friends. Whoever was asked about Mary, they only had good things to say about her. She was a loving wife with 2 beautiful children. Her husband, Ron, was the love of her life. There was in no way that Mary could be having a secret affair. So why was this writer accusing her of that? Mary's happy life took a dark turn in March of 1977 when she received the very first letter. The letter was written in eerie block letters demanding she stay away from Gordon. The letter said, quote, "Don't lie when questioned about knowing him. I know where you live and have been observing your house and know your children. This is no joke. Please take it serious. Everyone concerned has been notified and everything will be over soon." End quote. I can't imagine what Mary must have gone through while reading this letter. Now, Mary wasn't having any affair, and she was afraid that if she shared this with her husband, then he would be upset. And this was the first letter, so she thought that this might be a prank. So she kept this letter to herself. Over the next few weeks, more and more letters came, each one more threatening than the other. The letters not only accused her of being unfaithful, but also revealed secrets that only Mary knew. The writer obviously knew where she lived, but this person also knew what bus she drove, the name of her husband, her children, and some of her dark secrets that no one else knew. One letter to Mary reads, quote, "Lady, this is your last chance to report him. I know you're a pig and will prove it and shame you out of Ohio. A pig sneaks around and meets other women's husbands behind their backs, causes families and homes and marriages to suffer." End quote. Although scared and frustrated, she hid all these letters and kept her fears to herself. When Mary kept ignoring the letters, the writer seemed to get frustrated or maybe bored. Whichever was the case, he wrote the very next letter to Ron. The writer described Ron's wife's affair with Gordon and threatened to kill him if he didn't do anything about it. The writer claimed to know where Ron worked, what kind of car he had, and this proved to Ron that this person, whoever was writing these letters, was someone that they knew, or it was someone who was always watching them. As any confused husband would react, Ron confronted Mary and told her about the letter. Mary, of course, denied the affair, but she did admit to receiving multiple letters over the last few weeks. Ron and Mary decided on keeping this letter to themselves and ignore the person who was writing to them. They thought that if they did not react, this person would just stop writing. Unfortunately for them, Ron received another letter. The letter read that Ron knew about his wife's affair, but even then, he did not do anything about it. The writer further threatened that if Ron did not do anything about his wife's affair, then he would put up signs and billboards and even broadcast to the whole town, stating what his wife had done. A letter to Ron read, quote, "Gillespie, you have had 2 weeks and done nothing. Admit the truth and inform the school board. If not, I will broadcast it on posters, signs, and billboards until the truth comes out." End quote. The writer, who was adamant that an alleged affair was happening between Mary Gillespie and Gordon Massey, wrote to Ronald Gillespie, quote, "You should catch them together and kill them both." End quote. Besides the letters, Mary and Ron also started receiving phone calls, and they had no idea what to do. These threatening letters were increasing day by day, and so they decided that they would talk to one of their closest people and tell them what was going on. This would later prove to be Mary and Ron's worst mistake. Ron and Mary asked help from Ron's sister and her husband, Karen and Paul Ferrao. They worked hard and put together a list of suspects from the very beginning. Now, Mary had always suspected another school bus driver named David Longberry. David had attempted to flirt with her quite a few times, and Mary did not return his gestures. So she thought that maybe David was the one who was writing these letters to them. Now at this point, we have to understand that Mary believed she was the only one who was receiving the letters in this town. She had no idea about any other letters that came or would come. There was no information about any other person in the town receiving any of these letters. After adding David's name in their long list of letters, they decided that it was time they could return David back his favor. And the best way that they could do that was to write him a letter. They wrote a letter to David telling him to stop doing whatever he was doing, otherwise they would go to the police. I don't know whether this was kind of a luck or whoever was behind these letters was keeping an eye on them, because the letters stopped coming. But this would not be forever. In August of 1977, the letters and phone calls that had once stopped started again. And it was not just letters. Ron and Mary started seeing these signs posted all over town, written in the same crude block letters. These signs accused Mary of having an affair with Gordon, and the following letters said that Mary's 12-year-old daughter Tracy was not Ron's daughter, but was of Gordon. After all that had happened over the past few weeks, Mary was now frustrated and tired, and she needed to clear her head. And so she decided to get out of Circleville for some time. Ron, on the other hand, understood Mary and decided to stay at home and look after the children. On Friday, August 19, the Gillespies' home phone rang. The caller on the other side said that he was watching Ron and he knew what Ron was up to. Ron got really angry at this caller by now. He was tired, he was frustrated, and his wife had also left town to clear her head. Ron had no idea who this caller was, but he started ranting out to this letter writer, telling him that he was going to put an end to whatever this person was doing. As soon as Ron dropped the call, he grabbed his pistol, kissed his daughter goodbye, hopped onto his pickup truck, and left to find this letter writer. Unfortunately, Ron would never come back home. Around 10:25 p.m., just a few minutes after Ron had barged out of the house, sat in his car and left to find this man, he met with an accident. His 1971 Ford pickup crashed into a tree just a few miles away from his house. Although it was a familiar road, Ron failed to take the turn that would have saved his life. He was partially thrown from the truck and was declared dead on arrival at the hospital. When the county sheriff, Dwight Radcliffe, arrived at the scene, something looked strange. A bullet had been fired from Ron's gun, but there was no bullet anywhere, just an empty case. Initially, the police thought that maybe the letter writer took a shot at him, or maybe he just lost control of his truck while in pursuit, or it's someone who may have tried to run him off the road. But Ron's autopsy showed that his blood alcohol level at the time of his death was 0.16, which is twice the legal limit. So as far as the sheriff was concerned, Ron was drunk, he was driving in rage, he crashed, and he died. According to the police, this was a closed case. Ron was drunk and this caused his accident. But Ron's family was not ready to give up. According to them, Ron was not a heavy drinker and he was a responsible father. So him leaving his kids alone at night to pursue someone, that was not normal. The person on the other line must have said something that caused Ron to run out in search of him. Their own family begged the sheriff to go out and find out what happened. What was it that caused the accident? But unfortunately, Sheriff Radcliffe was done with the case. Ron's family demanded that they look at the truck, but they couldn't because it was sent to the junkyard and crushed just days after the incident. They later learned that the police actually had a suspect in custody, but this person had passed the polygraph test, and so they let this person go. They had no idea who this person was, but they assumed it was David. This led everyone to have more questions than answers. Why did the sheriff not pursue this case further? Who was their prime suspect? Why did they get rid of the car so fast? Was Ron murdered? Where once the town was receiving letters with their own secrets, especially Mary, there now the residents were receiving letters stating the sheriff was hiding something. And no one was more vocal about this fact than Ron's own brother-in-law, Paul Ferrao. Despite all this, Sheriff Radcliffe didn't budge. The letters continued to arrive even after Mary's husband's death, and the letter writer seemed to have a personal vendetta against the Gillespie family. The police were stumped, and the case went cold for 2 years. Then came a twist that no one in their wildest dreams could have ever imagined. Mary admitted to having a relationship with Gordon. But that's not all. She said that this relationship did not exist when the letters first appeared. In fact, according to Mary, they started their relationship in 1979, after the letters started coming in. One would think that now that Mary had finally told the truth, that the letter writer would stop writing. After all, this writer wanted Mary to come forward and tell everyone that she was having an affair. And she did. But sadly, this did not happen. Mary would continue to receive letters for over 40 years, calling her a homewrecker, murderer, and some even threatening her life and the safety of her children. The letters were not all that Mary was receiving. She also had to face graphic, violent, and vulgar posters of her story posted all over town, especially on her bus route. Day after day, she was forced to endure this mental torture. Mary's children would also see these posters every single day. And in 1983, Mary had enough. She was driving her school bus near the intersection where her husband had died a few years ago. She saw a sign posted about her relationship. It was similar to the many that she had seen around town. This post was about an inappropriate relationship with Gordon. Mary got out of the bus and went to get the sign down. And that's when she saw a piece of string connecting the sign to a box. It was about the size of a shoestring. She took the box, kept it in a bus, and went about doing her daily work. Once she had reached home, she opened it to find a handgun propped up by styrofoam blocks. The string was connected to a trigger. Mary immediately took the box to the police. Upon checking, they informed her that the gun was positioned in such a way that if Mary had been a little bit here and there when handling the box, she would have died. The gun was positioned to go off as soon as Mary opened the box. It was a miracle that she survived. It seemed like the letter writer was done with Mary and was ready to get rid of her. Maybe he wanted to show this murder as a suicide. I mean, the place where the gun was kept, it was the exact same spot where her husband had died. This also got me thinking, could this person have been the one behind Mary's husband's death? Forensic technicians said that the gun that was intended to kill Mary belonged to a man named Wesley. The police managed to track down Wesley, and when questioned, he said that he did in fact own this gun, but he had sold it to his supervisor at work. Guess who his supervisor was? Paul Ferrao. Yes, you heard me right. I said Paul Ferrao. The same Paul whom Mary and Ron had initially called in to help them find out who was sending these letters. When the police spoke to Paul, he did not deny that it was his gun. He said that it was his gun, but it had been stolen a few weeks ago and he just forgot to report it. Sounds very convenient, doesn't it? Paul insisted that he was innocent. In fact, he even went on to say that if the police had done their job right the first time, then Ron wouldn't have died and that he wouldn't be here accused of writing those letters. When the police checked his company records, they found that Paul had indeed taken a leave on the day the trap for Mary was laid. But Paul had an alibi. He never took the stand, but multiple witnesses said that they saw him in his house. He was getting work done on his house, and that's the reason that he took the day off. Paul's fingerprints were neither found on the sign or the box that held the gun. There was, however, circumstantial evidence which included him taking the day off. But as I mentioned before, he was getting work done and he was there at home. There were witnesses who saw him. Also, the box that held the gun was easily found at the place that Paul worked. Despite this, the police managed to get enough evidence against him that he was accused of writing those letters. The sheriff believed that he had done his job and Mary would never have to worry about getting another letter again. To prove that Paul was indeed the writer of those letters, the sheriff got Paul a few of the existing letters and asked him to replicate the handwriting. Once he had done that, he asked Paul to write a few more sentences in a similar handwriting. He wanted Paul to copy this handwriting as much as possible. I don't know why he did that, but he wanted Paul to copy that handwriting. Not Paul write something on his own in his own handwriting, but copy the Circleville Writer's handwriting. Once Paul had written, Sheriff took one look at those letters and confirmed that it was Paul who had written those letters. Paul was now under arrest for the attempted murder of Mary Gillespie, and he was now sentenced to 25 years in prison. While Paul was in prison, which was in Lima, Ohio, over 100 miles away from Circleville, somehow the letters managed to come. They were the same, written in that weird blocky handwriting and postmarked Columbus, Ohio. The prosecutor in Paul's case was accused of corruption, and the coroner who did Ron's autopsy was accused of child abuse. The abuse part later turned out to be true, so I can't say if all of that was true. As I said before, Mary was not the only one who was receiving these letters. Thousands of letters went out, each one holding a deep and dark secret of its reader. Some letters were even dusted with poison. The letters had their signature blocky letters, but they did not all look the same. Some thought that maybe the writer was trying to throw people off, and that's why this writer was trying to change their handwriting with every letter. But there were few who also thought that maybe the writer was not the same person, that it was not the same person who was writing all these letters to all these people. Sheriff Radcliffe demanded that the warden get Paul under control. But the warden said that there was no way that Paul was writing or sending so many letters from behind bars. It had to be someone else. Paul was strip searched and his incoming and outgoing mail was constantly monitored. But nothing that Paul did ever showed that he was the letter writer. To be completely honest, in my opinion, I can't say who was the writer. That is up to the authorities. But I don't think that Paul would be stupid enough to write letters from behind bars. I mean, he was literally in prison, the one place where you hardly have any form of privacy. Your phone calls, letters, and even visits are constantly monitored. And Paul was in prison for writing letters, which meant that his letters would be the first thing that would be checked and read by the authorities. So how could Paul be writing all these letters and sending out while he was in prison? In 1990, after being in prison for 7 years, Paul was up for parole. The parole board saw the ongoing hate for Paul and said that he was not ready to be out. The warden spoke on Paul's behalf, saying that he was a model prisoner and that he did not write these letters behind bars. None of this worked in his favor and his parole was denied. Shortly after the parole meeting, Paul received a letter of his own. The letter read, quote, "Fresh hour. Now when are you going to believe you aren't getting out of there? I told you 2 years ago when we set them up. They stay set up." End quote. During Paul's closing argument, his lawyer took the name of one person whom he believed was the Circleville letter writer. And that was none other than Paul's ex-wife and Ron's own sister, Karen. Paul believed that this was true while he was in prison. Also, Karen was one of the few people who knew that Paul's gun was hidden in the garage. When Paul was in prison, she regained custody of the house and her children, which she had lost during her divorce. Karen was in fact one of the first persons to link Paul to the letters. She told investigators that she found some letters in her house, including one that was torn apart and thrown in the commode. She said that she tried to piece this together, and when she saw the name Gillespie, she understood what it was. But I don't know why, Karen never kept these letters. Paul was released in 1993, 10 years after he was sent to prison. He never wavered from his statement, saying that he was innocent. Even when he died on June 28, 2012, at the age of 70, he kept on saying that he was not the letter writer. A journalist named Martin D. Yant came across the case and spent a lot of time trying to figure out where these letters were coming from. During his research, Mary told him that one of the other bus drivers had told her that she was driving on the same route the same day that Mary found the gun. And this was about 20 minutes before Mary had stopped on the spot and picked up that box. The driver drove through the intersection and there was a yellow El Camino that was parked there. The woman described a large man with sandy brown hair standing there near his car. She said she found it weird, the way he was there. When he saw her staring at him, he just turned around and acted as if he was going to the bathroom. She thinks that it's because he didn't want her to identify him. Now, this person was nowhere close to how Paul looked. All of this information was given to the police when Paul was still in prison. But despite knowing everything, the police never released him. Even though there was an eyewitness telling them that they had seen this person and this person looked nowhere close to how Paul was. After all these years, people believe that the person standing next to that El Camino was actually Karen's boyfriend, because his description fits exactly that person. When Martin was researching this case, he himself got a few letters threatening him to stop doing whatever he was doing. We don't know if these letters were written by the original Circleville letter writer or it was someone else who was just trying to replicate their work. The writer claimed that there were more booby traps around the town and they hadn't been set off. Unfortunately, the police were never able to identify these booby traps. It has to be noted that around the same time that Paul was released from prison, the letters stopped coming. The case has now been officially closed, but there are so many unanswered questions. Also, another person who was suspected to be involved but never actually brought forward was Paul's son. After Paul's divorce, his children separated between him and his wife, with his son taking the side of his mother. Although Paul never spoke in court or gave an interview regarding this matter, according to Martin, Paul believed that his son was the one who stole his gun and had something to do with that booby trap. If Karen was pulling the strings, then maybe this could be a possibility. But this is just a theory, as neither Paul nor Karen ever spoke about their son. In fact, Karen never spoke to Paul or anything about Paul to anyone ever. On September 11, 2002, in the Scioto River in Portsmouth, Ohio, 39-year-old Mark Ferrao's body was found floating in the river. He had shot himself. It would later be said that Mark suffered from depression. It is a possibility that Mark, being the letter writer, might just be another person in the mix, and he may have had nothing to do with it. In an interview, former FBI profiler Mary Ellen O'Toole said, quote, "If a crime continues on and you have someone in custody for a long period of time, you have to say, somebody else is sending these letters. They are not happening by magic. Somebody else is writing the letters. End quote. She said this because some experts still believed that even though Paul was behind bars, it was Paul who was writing those letters. They had no idea how he was doing it, but they believed that it was him. Maybe he had someone on the outside who had a bulk of pre-written letters from Paul and this person was sending them out. Or maybe there was a person on the outside who was connected to Paul and this person was writing whatever they wanted to write and Paul knew about it. There are hundreds of theories circulating around the fact that Paul may be the actual Circleville letter writer. For all we know, he may be the writer or he may be completely innocent. There is nothing to prove either of them. O'Toole believes that the writer is very deceptive because the way that the letters were written, it is impossible to figure out whether this was a male or a female. But with what was written in the first few letters that were sent, by those letters I mean, it was written, "I'm a boyfriend," and the way that the writer was trying to conceal their identity made O'Toole believe that maybe this writer was a female who was just trying to pose as a male. O'Toole, in an interview with 48 Hours, when asked how educated does she think this person could be, said, quote, "I would say this is not a highly educated person because of the quality of the sentences and how they were put together." End quote. She further added by saying that, quote, "If you read these letters, you will see that the writer was having a good time. The letter writer is very callous, and this person would have to know I'm hurting people, and that's okay with me." End quote. Paul was not only highly educated, but he was also in a managerial position. He did not fit the description of the letter writer. In 1990, the show Unsolved Mysteries did a segment on this case, but just before they released the episode, they received a letter of their own. The letter read, quote, "Forget Circleville, Ohio. If you come to Ohio, you El Sickos will pay." End quote. The letter was signed, the Circleville Writer. In the decades since the Circleville Letters mystery first started, many theories have been put forward about the identity of this letter writer. Some believe that the letters were written by a disgruntled former employee of the school district who was seeking revenge. Others think that the letters were written by someone who was trying to frame Paul. I'm guessing that someone could be Karen. Some even believe that the letters were the work of a serial killer who came in, had a good time, and then left. The only person who was killed in this entire scenario was Ron. No one else was hurt. Other than the emotional and mental torture that the people went through, no one other than Ron was seriously hurt. But the biggest lead came in 1983. Yes, that was the time when Paul was still in prison. In 1983, nearly 7 years after the letters first arrived, a suspect was finally arrested. Now, I couldn't find a lot of details on this because some say that this person was arrested, some say that this person was caught, was questioned and then let go. But either ways, this person was not charged. This person was a suspect but was not charged. This person was David Longberry. Longberry had a history of mental illness and had even been committed to a mental institution in the past. He was found guilty of attempted murder for a booby trap he had set for the sheriff, but he was never charged with the Circleville Letters. As I said, the police thought that maybe he was the writer, but they were not certain. Once again, there was no solid proof tying any one of these people to the letters. Many still believe that Longberry was the author, but this case remains unsolved to this day. The Circleville Letters mystery has gone down in history as one of the most bizarre and unsettling cases of its kind. Even now, over 4 decades later, the identity of the author remains a mystery, and the town of Circleville is still haunted by the events of the summer of 1976. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. If you enjoyed it, please leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or your preferred platform. It really helps me reach new listeners. If you have a true crime story or a case that you'd like me to cover on a future episode, please send in an email. I'll link it in the description. I'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe to the 3am Fear podcast so you do not miss any future episodes. You can find my YouTube and social media links in the description box so you're always updated. If you love thrillers, I have a free thriller ebook listed in the description. Do check it out. Until then, stay kind and stay safe out there. See you next week.